King's Gambit vs E captures f4. Part 1. White pawn to e4. Black pawn to e5. White pawn to f4. Black pawn captures white pawn on f4. White knight from g1 to f3. Black pawn to g5. White pawn to h4. Black pawn to g4. White knight from f3 to e5. Black pawn to h5. White bishop to c4. Black knight from g8 to h6. White pawn to d4. Black pawn to d6. White knight from e5 to d3. Black pawn to f3. White pawn captures black pawn on f3. Black bishop to e7. White bishop to e3. Black bishop captures white pawn on h4 check. White king to d2. Black knight from b8 to c6. White knight from b1 to c3. Black knight from c6 to a5. White bishop from c4 to b3. Black knight captures white bishop on b3 check. White pawn captures black knight on b3. Black pawn captures white pawn on f3. White queen captures black pawn on f3. Black bishop to g4. White queen to f4. Black queen to f6. White knight from c3 to d5. Black queen captures white queen on f4. White knight captures black queen on f4. Black bishop to d8. White knight captures black bishop on h5. Black bishop to f3. White knight from h5 to f6 check. Black bishop captures white knight on f6. White knight captures black bishop on f6 check. Black king to e7. White rook captures black rook on h6. Black rook captures white rook on h6. White knight from d5 to f6 check. Black king to d7. White bishop captures black rook on h6. Black pawn to f5. White rook to g1. Black bishop captures white pawn on e4. White rook to g7 check. Black king to c6. White knight captures black pawn on c7. Black rook to d8. White pawn to c4. Black rook to d7. White rook captures black rook on d7. Black king captures white rook on d7. White knight from c7 to d5. Black king to e6. White knight from d5 to c3. Black bishop to f3. White bishop to f4. Black pawn to a6. White pawn to d5 check. Black king to d7. White knight from c3 to a4. Black pawn to b5. White knight from a4 to b6 check. Black king to c7. White pawn to c5. Black king to d8. White pawn captures black pawn on d6. Black pawn to a5. White bishop to g5 check. Black king to e8. White pawn to d7 check. Black king to f7. White pawn promotes to queen on d8. Black pawn to b4. White queen to f6 check. Black king to g8. White queen to g6 check. Black king to f8. White knight to d7 checkmate.